Thanks very much, everybody, for your presentations. And I think what we've heard today are very stark figures around data centres and indeed around the fossil fuel industry. Just to start with Dr. Tianhara, just a question for you. Our government recently banned the exploration for fossil fuels offshore, and we have a ban on fracked gas internally in the country. Do you think it's contradictory, therefore, then, that the government would encourage liquefied natural gas to be imported into the country and to look at the possibility of terminals in the number of applications that are in? And do you think it's time for this type of activity to be banned? And I want to thank Senator Boylan for connecting the ban between LNGs and data centres, because that's very much what the People Before Profit Bill would do if it were to get passed on Thursday. It is about banning both of those, fossil fuel infrastructure and the proliferation of data centres. That doesn't mean we shut down the existing data centres. We've over 70 of them in the country, but it does mean that we stop the development of further ones. And I do honestly believe it's linked to the liquefied natural gas terminals. If 59% of gas reserves should remain in the ground, and if we take account of full cycle emissions from the production of the gas to the distribution of it, would you believe that it is necessary, therefore, to ban the be consistent to ban the importation of liquefied natural gas if you're banning the exploration for gas and oil offshore and fracked gas onshore? My question to Dr. Breslin, I think it's very interesting about the whole issue that's arose here today about what data centres are used for and the type of business model that they represent, because I think it's clear that the business model that the companies who are building the data centres and using them mostly is about mining data in order to advertise and sell and develop a business around what sort of more things they can sell to the population. And that goes back to the point made by Dr. Tianhara about reducing the amount of energy we actually use and having to make decisions. And they have to be stark decisions because we are in a climate emergency. But the key question I'd like you to address a bit further, Dr. Breslin, is when you say in your statement that Ireland shoulders more than a fair share of the energy and water burden of global digital activities, and the prospects of energy insecurity may carry greater reputational and economic damage than a moratorium on data centre development. Would you please just expand on that a wee bit, because I think there's a cohort of deputies and senators who believe we're damaging ourselves by not expanding the data industry, and you make quite the opposite argument, plus the argument you make around just transition, how this impacts on communities, how they perceive that they're bearing the burden of it because it is eating into our electricity supply. And sorry, I just want to go back to one last question to Dr. Tianhara. I mean, there has to be an answer to all this, and you mentioned in your presentation beyond gas and oil alliance demand, and that is that we need to address both demand and supply simultaneously. And I agree with you, and I believe that the severity of the climate crisis dictates that we need the state to directly intervene on the question of supply, i.e. to create state-led, controlled and delivered renewable energy power companies. We've done it before with the ESB in the 30s and 40s. We could absolutely do it again. And I'd like you, if you have time, to comment on that, please.
Thank you, Deputy Smith. And I might ask our witnesses to be as brief as they could be, given we have 6 or 7 minutes remaining, and I want to bring in Deputy Devlin, and I have some comments and questions as well. So I think Dr. Bresnan is first.
Sure, thank you. I'll just be very brief then in terms of that comment and the expanding on that point in the statement. So that point about reputational damage, I was referring quite specifically to the recent sort of news about Intel's expansion. And there was this issue that came up about whether they were going to invest in a bigger expansion of their plant in Leixlip or not, and whether that came down to questions about energy security. It's not clear whether it is or not. I think it was just interesting that became, that was an issue, that was raised. And I just think that in terms of if there are brownouts or blackouts this winter, you know, it doesn't look great in terms of Ireland wanting to attract whether it's data centers or other kinds of industries. But the other bit about reputational damage is, I think, around climate and energy commitments. And I do think, this thing about words versus actions, I mean, the figures are stark. They really are stark. And Ireland is known as a hub for these data centres, but it's also becoming known both in Ireland amongst the public and outside Ireland that there are contradictions there around the data centre expansion, our energy security and our climate obligations. And if we continue down this path in the hope that there might be some kind of technological solution, and it doesn't look like that's likely, that is going to cause more reputational damage, not just about inward investment, but just generally about Ireland's commitment to these things. So that's all I'd add to that point.
Thank you, Dr. Resnan. And Dr. Teen Hara.
So thanks very much for those questions. First off, I would applaud Ireland for going as far as ruling out offshore oil and gas and fracking onshore. That's a lot more than my country has done. However, I do agree that then sort of building out infrastructure for importing gas is somewhat inconsistent, particularly because if you look at the energy costs that are required to compress gas for transport as LNG, it does seem very inconsistent to me. And I also just worry about the lock-in effect of that infrastructure, because as I've noted, these infrastructures are built for long periods of time. So it makes it harder to transition, particularly when you add on top of that the things like the Energy Charter Treaty, which help reinforce that kind of lock-in. In terms of how we address demand and supply, there are interesting proposals. There's that Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. There's an academic/activist proposal for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So there are interesting efforts there. But I do tend to agree with you that the state needs to lead, and there are increasing calls for the energy sector to be nationalized, for it to be more public companies providing energy. Again, I would just bring it back to there is this threat that anytime you nationalize or take public control of any aspect of the private sector, not just the energy sector, you do run the risk of being sued under these investment treaties. So as part of a broader plan to go that route, we also need to get rid of these treaties. Thanks very much for this question.